Thank you again for joining us for this webinar on the TN visa and specifically the requirements of the TN visa and whether it requires sponsorship. My name is Dustin Saldariaga and I am an immigration attorney with Scott Legal PC. As I mentioned, today we're going to spend some time talking about the TN visa. The TN visa is one of the most common visas that we assist our clients with. And again, specifically, we'll be talking about the visa requirements and a question that's often raised by employers, which is whether the visa requires sponsorship. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know that the founder of our firm, Ian Scott, was actually on a TN visa for about a decade. And he went through a number of renewals. So he has personally navigated this process a number of times. And that experience really does inform the way that we work with our clients to demystify the process. Our firm is a full-service immigration firm. We handle family-based cases, business-based cases, really the full variety of immigration cases. The TN visa is one part of that, but please don't hesitate to reach out if you have an immigration question relating to any other aspect of immigration law. This webinar is part of an ongoing series. We try to do at least 2 webinars each month, and we cover a range of immigration topics. At the end of the webinar, we'll be sending you the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen now. We'll also send a comprehensive guide on the TN visa. We'll send you a link where you can sign up for the additional webinars that I mentioned a moment ago. And we'll also send you a link to this recording of this webinar. The webinar is being recorded. I also want to mention that we post our webinars on our YouTube channel. So if you were unable to attend a webinar in the past, do check out our YouTube channel. We post the full webinars on there. And we also have a number of shorter videos that address some of the common questions we receive about TN visas, e-visas, family-based visas. So do check out our YouTube channel. We put a lot of good information there, obviously for free. If you have a question during the presentation, please send it to me using either the question and answer box on Zoom or using the chat box. I have both opened on my screen. I might answer it in the moment it comes up, or I might save it till the end, but I will try to answer all of the questions that come up during the presentation, so don't hesitate to ask. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive in. The TN visa requirements explained. So on your screen, you see the requirements for a TN visa. The TN visa is one of the most straightforward work-based visas that someone can apply for. It is limited to citizens of Canada or Mexico. The TN visa is rooted in NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico to get a TN visa. Your profession that you are coming to the US to work within must appear on a specific list of professions that are provided in the TN regulations. Now, throughout this presentation, I will be referring to these regulations. If you want to have it open on your screen, I will send the link right now in the chat. So you can click this link if you want to use Google. If you just Google NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations. If you Google that, the first link is likely going to be to the TN regulations. So if you look at those regulations, scroll down, you'll see a table that lists professions. The first is accountant, then you'll see architect, then computer systems analyst, and the list goes on. In order to come to the US on a TN visa, the work you're doing has to fall within one of these professional categories. The next requirement, and you see it up on this PowerPoint presentation, is that you must have the required qualifications to practice that given profession. So if you just look at the first item on the list, accountant, you see it says baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA, which are professional licenses for accountants. So that is your educational requirement. So to come to the US as an accountant, as an example, you need to be coming to the US to work as an accountant, and you need that educational requirement for an accountant. Now, some of the professions have different requirements. Some professions will allow you to come to the US with work experience, where you don't actually need any kind of a degree. An example that comes up often is management consultant. So if you're able to look at management consultant, the requirement is a bachelor's degree or equivalent professional experience, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about the management consultant category, which is one of the more difficult categories to satisfy, actually. But my point in raising it now is that the first step that anyone wanting a TN visa needs to take is A, check that your profession's on the list, and B, make sure that you satisfy the education or experience requirement. The fourth bullet on your screen in the presentation, you see you must have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. So you do need to have a job offer from an employer in the US. That job offer needs to be in writing. So oftentimes what we'll provide to our clients is a letter that's signed by the employer, where the employer is saying, this is our company, this is what our company does, this is why we need to hire, say, an accountant. We need to hire this person for 3 years. 3 years, as we'll discuss later, is the maximum amount of time that you can receive a TN visa for. And you know, once they come to the US, they're going to be working for our firm. So a TN visa is not a visa to come to the US and then begin looking for a job. You need to have the offer in hand, a letter from the employer in hand, before you actually apply for the visa. And finally, in that job, you must be employed to engage in professional activities that are consistent with the listed profession. We'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. But for example, if you are coming to the US as an accountant, let's say that your job, you've got an offer, the job title is accountant, but when you actually look at what the person's doing, let's say they're doing something like computer programming. There's a good chance that the government would look at that and say, well, even though your job title is accountant, you're coming to the US to do computer programming. That's not what we think of as what an accountant should do, and that could be a basis for a denial. So you want to make sure that your job is aligned with what the government thinks that your job should do. And the main resource that we use to figure that out is what's called ONET, O-N-E-T. And I'll go ahead and post a link to this. ONET is one resource. The other resource is called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH, which is a publication of the US Department of Labor. So what I'll do is share with you all the link for, I keep using accountants as an example since it's alphabetically the first on the list. This link I'm sharing now through the chat is the link to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, where it says what accountants do. So once you have a sense of the job you'll be doing, you want to make sure that you'll actually be doing the tasks that are listed on, say, the Occupational Outlook Handbook as published by the Department of Labor. If you're coming to work as a lawyer, go ahead and do that search for lawyers, see how the government defines that role, and just make sure that the letter that the employer provides to you has you doing those job duties that are listed on either the Occupational Outlook Handbook or ONET. So again, a number of these bullet points we'll revisit as we go through the presentation, but this is really a high-level view of the TN visa requirements. And again, the TN visa is not an especially complicated visa. If you satisfy these requirements on the screen, really the process should be straightforward, with the exception of some notable job titles, which we'll talk about later. So what is sponsorship? When many people, and especially employers, think about sponsorship, they think about something along the lines of an H-1B visa. So An H-1B visa requires that an employer actually find out if there are US workers who can do the job. That visa also requires that a worker who comes in to the US on an H-1B visa is paid a prevailing wage. And that wage is typically higher than minimum wage. The employer also needs to comply with certain requirements, like they cannot what's called bench. They cannot bench the employee, which means that they bring them into the US and then they don't give them work. They have to make sure that the worker is employed. If the employer is terminated, the employer might have an obligation to fly the employee, pay for the employee's transportation back home. None of those requirements apply to a TN visa. And for that reason, we would say that a TN visa does not require sponsorship. And it certainly doesn't require sponsorship in the way that more traditional work-based visas, such as the H-1B, do require. So if the applicant is applying at a consulate or at the border, if they're Canadian, really the employer plays next to no role in the application process. The only thing the employer would do in that situation is give the employee a letter that talks about, as I mentioned before, the job title, why there's a need, the job duties, how much the person will be paid, etc. But it will be the worker, the employee, who's actually going to the consulate, applying for the visa, or going to the border and applying for the visa. There is no form other than that letter. There is no form or application that the employer files. There's also no contract in place. Really, there's nothing, no obligation on the employer. If the employee is given the visa either at the consulate or is admitted at the border on a TN visa, they're an at-will employee and they're treated just as any other employee would be. So what that means is the employer can fire them at will. The employee can quit at will. The only pay requirements are really the minimum wage requirements that are either federal or state or local that, again, apply to any worker. It's not specific to an immigrant worker or a TN worker. So the obligations on the employer are minimal, especially if the application is filed at a consulate or if the employee is applying at the border, if they're Canadian. Now, if the individual is already within the US and they're applying for TN status through US Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, the application process is slightly different. What they would do is the employer would file a Form I-129. And that is a form that the employer would sign and would file, asking the government to allow the employee to have TN status in order to work for the employer. So that is an exception where we still would not consider that sponsorship. There still are no additional requirements on the employer, but if the application is filed domestically, then the employer would be filing the application rather than the employee. A helpful example might be if a student is in the US, let's say they studied to be an accountant, they've just finished their accounting program, they have their degree, and they received a job offer from an accounting firm, and that person doesn't want to leave the US and re-enter to get a TN visa, they'd rather apply within the US, then it would be that employer that would file the Form I-129 and apply for the employee to get the status. Okay, so differences for Canadians and Mexican nationals. We've already touched on this a bit, but I'll go ahead and make the process a little more explicit. Canadians have a couple options for to apply for a TN visa. Most conveniently, and what we see and recommend that most Canadians do, is that they actually apply at the border, not at a consulate, that they actually apply when they're entering the United States. So they would bring with them the letter from the employer, they would bring with them their passport, proof of their citizenship. They would bring documentation showing that they satisfy either the educational or the work qualification requirement, the experience requirement. And they would approach the immigration officer, whether it's at the airport or whether it's at a land crossing. And they would say, I'm applying for TN status. Here are my documents. Here's my job offer. Here are my qualifications. Here's my passport. And at that point, the officer will review. And if the Canadian is approved, typically they're given status for 3 years. Spouses also, if they're Canadian, can also apply. If a spouse is granted status, they would get what's called a TD visa rather than a TN visa. But Canadians are typically given the visa or status for 3 years. Canadians can also go to a consulate, which is extremely rare. There's really not a good reason for a Canadian to go to a consulate rather than applying at the border directly, with certain very limited exceptions. One of which is that if a Canadian national is married to someone who is not a Canadian national, then the spouse must go to the consulate to apply for the TD visa. Now, Mexicans cannot apply at the border. Mexicans must go to a US consulate to apply for a visa. I see that question came up. The process is still relatively streamlined. The Mexican applicant would go online, would file a form DS-160, which is an online form. It's filed with the consulate. They would say they're applying for a TN visa. They will be invited to do biometrics, fingerprints, for example, and then they'll be invited for an interview at the consulate. And at that point, they would provide all of the documents that the Canadian would provide: the job offer letter, proof of experience or education, and obviously their passport, their citizenship. And then they would be granted an actual TN visa. And Mexicans, as opposed to Canadians, typically receive a validity period of 1 year on their visa rather than 3. That being said, when a Mexican national enters the US on their TN visa, they can request 3 years of status. And oftentimes CBP, the border officers, will grant that. Now, in order to be given that, it's important that the job offer letter say that the employer wants to employ them for 3 years. So if your job offer letter only says, I want to employ this person for 1 year, you're going to have a hard time getting that 3 years of status. So when you get that employer letter, make sure that the employer puts the maximum amount of time, if that's aligned with both the employer and the employee's wishes. For renewals in Mexico, sometimes Mexico will provide a streamlined process where the applicant can apply for a renewal through mail. So oftentimes you'll only learn that once you apply at the consulate, and then they'll follow up with you and say you actually don't need to come in, go ahead and mail your documents. But do know that that is something that does happen. So I mentioned before that there are a couple TN categories that are especially complicated. The two that I'll talk about here are, and really these are the two primary categories, that when a client comes to us and says, I want to come to the US as a management consultant or as an economist, we have to pay particular attention to navigating a few risks that are specific to those two job titles. Management consultants, this is one of the only categories where an applicant does not need to satisfy an educational requirement. So if someone doesn't have a college degree, but they want a TN visa, one of the only ways they can get one is to say, I'm a management consultant. So for that reason, the government really scrutinizes management consultants. They, as I mentioned, they can qualify based on experience alone, and that can be either 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. A common example that we see is say there's someone who is very savvy with social media. They're good at marketing. They're good at using TikTok, Facebook, Instagram to advertise a company and their products and services, but they don't have a college degree. A common tactic that's attempted, but is very risky, is to say, well, I'll get an offer from an employer and they'll say that this person's coming to the US as a management consultant who's going to advise the company on how to market their services. That can be done, but again, it is a risky job category. It's a risky way to approach a TN visa. So there are a few things that are very important to do if you're thinking about applying as a management consultant. The first thing I'll say is, if you're actually coming to work for a management consulting firm, such as McKinsey, BCG, Bain, and you're a management consultant in Canada or Mexico, that is a very straightforward process. That's not going to be considered a risky application because it's so clear that you fit into the category. However, if you are coming to the US, not to work for a management consulting firm, say you're coming to work for that company to advise them on how to market their services, the example I used before, and you're social media savvy, what you want to do is you want to make it very clear what the company's specific need is. Say that their need is to break into a specific market, or their need is to learn how to use a certain technology, and or address a very specific problem that they're facing, and that the employee has that specific experience and specialty that they are going to come to the US and specifically help the company address that problem. That's how you want to frame it. You want to have a very specific, discrete problem that the company is experiencing and that the applicant is uniquely qualified to address. And you want to make it very clear in the qualification component. So if, say, they don't have a college degree, but they have 5 years of experience, you want to have letters lined up that show that are from prior employers or from prior clients, that say this person has specifically helped our company with overcoming this problem. The letter should be signed, original signature, and you really want to show how they really are coming to the US to address that specific need. You see on the screen this third sub-bullet. Unless the applicant is coming to work for a management consulting firm, the position must be supernumerary. What that means is that the government is going to look very closely to make sure that this person coming in as a management consultant is not replacing another role. So if we take the social media consultant, the concern there would be, this is a person who's coming in actually to work as a marketer, and they may be replacing a marketer at the company, someone who works in marketing at the company. That's going to be a huge risk. So it'll be very important to frame that application to say the person is coming in a role that we don't already have at the company. They really are coming in from the outside to advise us, to help us overcome the specific problem that we're facing. So if you're coming in as a management consultant, you can probably already tell working with an attorney is particularly important. So you would be well advised, if you're trying to navigate that category, to consult with an attorney. The other category that is particularly risky is economists. And the reason is that in 2017, the government narrowed the scope of what it considers economists. If you remember, when I was talking about the first slide, where I explained how the government defines a role, going to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and actually seeing how do they define what an accountant does, the government essentially narrowed how it defines what an economist does. Before 2017, people were coming to the US on TN visas in the economist category to work as financial analysts, to perform market research, to do things of that nature. In 2017, the government explicitly excluded financial analysts and market research analysts from the economist category. So if you are applying to come to the US in an economist category, it's especially important to spend time on the Occupational Outlook Handbook and ONET and make sure that your job duties are aligned there. So in general, what economists are supposed to do is to use econometrics, use math and quantitative analysis to analyze markets, to analyze where opportunities are, to analyze economic problems and opportunities that are affecting a company. And it really is supposed to be rooted in that economic analysis. You'll see that if you search for OOH or ONET in the economist category, but really walking away from the idea that financial analysts and market research analysts are included in that. Again, this is a category that it's worthwhile to work with an attorney if you're considering the economist category, just like the management consultant category. Okay, and one other thing I should have mentioned before is on the educational qualification. When you see in the regulations that a bachelor's degree is required, so if we look at accountant, you see that a bachelor's degree is required or a professional license. Let's say you don't have a professional license, but you're applying based on the bachelor's degree. The degree does need to either be in accounting, or if it's not in accounting, it needs to be very clear that you've taken significant coursework in that subject matter area. So for an accountant, we ideally would have a bachelor's degree in accounting. If you don't have a bachelor's degree in accounting, let's say you have a degree in economics, we would want to see that you've taken a number of accounting courses pursuant to your economics degree. And what we would do is we would have our client bring with them a transcript, and we would actually highlight in the transcript all of the classes that are relevant to accounting and make that argument clear. It's not a guarantee that the border officer would accept that. They might say that they want to see an accounting degree. So be aware that there is risk if you don't have a degree that's explicitly in line with the job category. So let's talk a little bit more about the application process. I already touched on most of this before, but Canadians have the option to apply at a port of entry. Mexican nationals do not. Canadians would provide the job offer letter and supporting documentation evidencing proof of citizenship, that's their passport, as well as their educational and professional qualifications, or really more specifically, whatever qualifications the regulations require. Let's take an example again. And the reason I want to look at this is to emphasize that when the regulations say or, you don't need to satisfy both requirements. So if we just look at accountant says bachelor's degree or a professional license, CPA, etc. What that means is, according to the regulations, you don't need both. If you satisfy the bachelor's degree, you don't also need the professional license to satisfy the qualification component. All right. Another very common example that we talked about before is management consultant. Let's say management consultant, you can satisfy the requirement through either a degree or professional experience. So if you have a degree in management or management consulting, you don't also need professional experience, okay, to satisfy the experience requirement. So keep that in mind. A lot of people apply when they prepare their own applications. They'll apply, let's say, for the management consultant, and they'll have a degree in management, and then they'll think it's also helpful to show that they also have 3 years of experience. That can complicate an application, because when the officer sees 3 years of experience, they're thinking, oh, but you need 5 years of experience. And you may risk a denial because the officer may be confused. Whereas what you want to do is say, the regulations require a degree or experience. I have the degree, so I'm not even looking at experience to satisfy the experience requirement. In the job offer letter, it's fine for the employer to go into detail about why, in addition to having the degree, your experience matters for the job, right? That you're the ideal person to perform the role they're hiring you for. But that's different from satisfying the experience or education requirement pursuant to the regulations. All right, so getting back to the bullet points on the screen, this third bullet under Canadians is especially important. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So especially if you're a first-time TN visa applicant, it is strongly recommended that you reach out to the port of entry before you arrive there and ask if they are currently processing TN applications and what the process is. Like, is there a certain window of time when they do that? Or is there anything else that you would need to keep in mind? Especially during COVID, some ports of entry are limiting the number of people that they will see at a given time. So you certainly want to be aware of that. So call ahead of time, make sure you're clear when they're receiving TN visa applications. For Mexican nationals, as I mentioned before, you must apply at a US consulate. To do that, you'll file a DS-160 form, which is online. You'll pay the visa application fee. You'll schedule your biometrics. You'll get instructions to do that from the consulate. You'll schedule an interview appointment. You'll attend your interview, bring your supporting documents at that time, and should receive the visa soon thereafter. As I mentioned, renewal applicants, those who already have a TN visa and are just applying to renew it, may be eligible for a streamlined process where they can just send in their materials, which is great. And the consulate will let you know if you qualify for that. And finally, the third option available to both Canadian nationals and Mexican nationals is to apply from within the United States through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS. To do that, the employer would file the form I-129, and they would include in that application all of the supporting documents, proof of the educational requirements, work, professional experience, as well as the job offer letter. All right. Some final tips, and then I will turn to the questions. I see a number of great questions have rolled in. So some tips and common TN visa pitfalls. As I mentioned before, call ahead to the port of entry. If you're unfamiliar with the procedures, and even if you are, because during COVID, the procedures have changed a number of times. You want to make sure that the employer, the individual who signs your job offer letter, is available by phone, and you just give them a heads up when you'll be crossing the border and make sure that they are available at the number that they put on the job offer letter, because some border officers will call that number and want to make sure to talk with the person who signed it. Related to that, if you put a link to a website for the business, make sure the website is live. There are examples where a border officer will visit the website, see that it's not actually live, and will question whether the business and the job offer is legitimate, and may deny the application based on that. So do make sure that the website is live as well. If you're applying at a consulate or the border, make sure to bring original documents with you. Border officers encounter a lot of fraud, and so they typically will not accept copies of documents. So bring your original diploma, bring an official transcript. The employer letter that you bring should have the original signature on it. That letter should have the company's letterhead that has all of their contact information in the letterhead: phone number, email address, physical address. And really, you know, a lot of people, this is one of the most common questions we receive: do I have to bring originals? We always say to bring originals. There are stories of people getting through without originals. Those are the exception. The government's been very clear that in general they want originals. So it's best not to risk a denial. Prepare to bring the originals with you. And finally, I know this question came up as well. The TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. What that means is that you must show that you have the intention to leave the US at the end of your stay, at the end of your visa. So sometimes border officers will want to see evidence that you have ties to your home country. This is usually only relevant if you've had a TN visa for a number of times. If you've renewed it 2, 3, 4 times, they might want evidence that you actually still have ties to Canada or Mexico. If you haven't been renewing your TN visa, this is usually not a question that comes up. If it does come up, things that you may want to show are if you own any property in Canada or Mexico, if you have an apartment, if you have a home, if you have any bank accounts there. You can bring recent bank statements that show that you have accounts in either of those 2 countries. If you have family there, you can show evidence that you have family that lives there and you have family ties. If you have close family member who's in school, you can bring documentation that they remain enrolled in school in Mexico or Canada. So evidence like that. You can really think creatively about, what are the ties that I have to Mexico or Canada, and create a full list of those ties, and then what documents can I come up with, can I gather to show those ties if I'm asked about them. But again, this is not a common question that comes up. Okay, so we are at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. So again, I see a number of questions have come in. I'll start with the chat. Is the application from within the US the same process with TN renewal? So in general, yes, the process it would be the same. So you would also, within the US, you would have to apply through USCIS. You would simply file an extension application to renew your status, and you would provide those supporting documents that we discussed before, including a letter from the employer talking about how long you'll be employed, your pay rate, your job title, all the things you'll be doing. Everything would still apply there. Once a visa is issued, how long does the applicant have to wait and start working in the US? So as soon as you're issued the visa, you can come in and begin working for the employer. The issue that some people face is that sometimes they want to come in early. You cannot come in more than 10 days before your employment will begin. So if you're trying to come into the US, let's say it's March 8th today, and the employer letter says that you're going to start on April 1st, you wouldn't be allowed in. You have to come in at most 10 days before your employment begins. But once you actually receive the visa, you can come in. Okay, is WES mandatory for credential evaluation if the degrees are from other than Canada? Great question. So you do not need a credential equivalency certification if your degree is from Canada, Mexico, or the United States. If you got your degree from one of those 3 NAFTA countries, you don't need any other additional certification. If your degree is from outside of one of those 3 countries, so for example, let's say you studied in London and you have an economics degree from London, you would actually need an equivalency certificate where one of these third-party evaluation companies would look at your degree from London and would say, in the United States, the degree that this person received in London is equivalent to a master's degree, is equivalent to a bachelor's degree in the United States. You would need that if the degree was awarded outside of Canada, Mexico, or the United States. Can I buy a house in the US after building credit under a TN visa? There should not be a problem buying a home in the US. That shouldn't be an issue. How easy is it to get TD dependent visa for spouse and kids? It's typically quite straightforward. If the principal is on a TN visa, then typically we don't see many issues with the TD visa being awarded to spouses or children. Spouses, right, so usually it's not an issue. All right. Okay, just to quickly confirm, a TD visa, you do have to be careful. TD visa does not allow work authorization. It does allow the opportunity to study. So, so the spouse or children should be aware of that. Once you get a TN visa and travel for vacation outside of the US, are you expected to bring all of the documentation with you, or do you just say you already have a TN visa? Typically, you don't need to bring all of the documentation with you. You would have your passport stamp showing that you entered on a TN visa on a certain date, or if you applied within the US, you would have the I-797 approval notice. And typically you would be able to travel with that and show at the border that you had been approved before, you're still within the time frame that you were granted for. My personal recommendation is it doesn't hurt to bring the additional documentation with you just in case you face questions. There are some officers that may be in a bad mood, might want to question you. So, you know, a TN application is not a large one. Usually it's shorter than 20 pages or so. So I would typically recommend just having those documents just in case you get questions, but usually you wouldn't receive any questions about that. Okay. Can I purchase a house? Yes. How much % down payment is needed? That is, I don't think that's an immigration question. So you would have to speak with your mortgage company, your bank. In the case of Mexican degrees, do they have to be translated to English? That is a great question. The answer is yes. Any documents that are not in English should be translated into English. Are you allowed to make investments into stock side businesses on a TN visa? In general, yes. If you are, for example, putting money into a Vanguard fund, that shouldn't be a problem on a TN visa. You want to be careful if it becomes active work. Your work authorization is with the TN employer specifically. You're not allowed to work outside of the TN worker. So if you know, if your investment moves from putting money into Vanguard into becoming an active venture capital investor, an angel investor, and that's what you're doing 20 hours a week, you could very well be accused of working without authorization. But if you're simply taking part of your wages and putting them into passive investments, that's not a problem. Can the TN visa be converted to a green card petition at a later time? The answer is no. The TN visa does not convert to a green card. However, someone on a TN visa, just like essentially any other status in the US, with some exceptions, you essentially need to satisfy the independent basis for the green card. So the way it works in the US is to get a green card, you either need a family-based petitioner or an employer-based petitioner who's applying for the green card on your behalf. So if you have that, you can be in the US on a TN visa and then file a green card application. So let's say you're on a TN visa and you marry a US citizen, you would become eligible for a green card based on that. Or if you have a family member in the US, a parent, for example, who's a US citizen, or a sibling who's a US citizen, they could petition for a green card. Or if while you're on a TN visa, your employer decides to sponsor you for a green card, that would be fine. But the TN visa really doesn't play a role in that. You would have to satisfy the green card requirements independently. Which port of entry are recommended for TN visa stamping? Frankly, we see a lot of applications at Peacebridge. We see a lot of applications at Buffalo, for example. Pearson, the Pearson airport tends to be particularly strict. So if you're going through Pearson, you want to make sure you have a very clear, strong application. Pearson also will sometimes ask the applicant to break down how they're spending their hours each week in the job to make sure that the job duties are not only aligned, but that they're going to be spending time on the job duties that are aligned. So there's really no way to anticipate or prepare for that. Sometimes they'll give an actual worksheet and have the applicant fill it out at the moment that they're at the airport. But just be aware, Pearson, they can ask additional questions. They've been known to ask additional questions. Does the job title have to match the official titles in the TN law? The answer is no. The job title does not need to match. What's far more important is that the job duties match. It is okay if the title doesn't match. It can be a strategic move, though, if your employer is open to matching the job title with the title in the regulations. It removes one potential question you might get. Why does the job title say X rather than Y? But it doesn't need to match. Can you have a master's degree in Canada and a bachelor's from a non-NAFTA country? It doesn't really matter where you have the degree from, as long as you satisfy the educational requirement. And if the degree is from a non-NAFTA country, you do need that equivalency certification that I mentioned before. So it's not necessary to change my TN visa if in the document it says 1 year, but in my offered letter it says 3 years. What happens when I enter to the US after my visa is expired? So you won't be able to enter the US after your visa has expired. You must have a valid visa to enter the US. If you are Canadian, you would apply at the border, and essentially, if you don't have the visa already, you would present all the materials we talked about before, and they would grant you new status when you enter. But essentially, there's a difference between a visa and status. So let's say you're a Mexican national and you apply for a TN visa at the consulate. Your visa, which is in your passport, would say that you have 1 year on your visa. What that means is that you essentially have a 1 year window of time when you can enter and exit the US. Each time you enter the US, you're given status. And what I said before about the 3 years is that if you're a Mexican national and your visa's for 1 year, let's say you enter on the last day of that 1 year period. When you enter the US, you would probably be given 1 year of status. But if your employment letter says we want to employ this person for 3 years, you could ask for the maximum period of time of status. But if let's take that extreme example where you enter on the last day, you're given 1 year of status upon entry. If you leave after your visa's expired, you cannot come back in unless you have a new visa. All right. So I have a couple questions about, do I qualify? I'm going to stay away from answering those specific ones. What I would say is take a look at the regulations, see what job title fits your job duties, and then see if you fit the educational or experience requirements. If it would be helpful to schedule a consultation, on our website, we offer 30-minute and 1 hour consultations. So feel free to schedule a time. If I'm already in the US on a TD visa and looking to get a TN for the first time, can you apply at the border, or do you have to go through the USCIS application process? You can certainly go through the border if you're Canadian. You would just pull together the application materials, leave the US, come back in, and when you come back in to re-enter, you would present your TN application materials. Can I keep both a TN and a B1, B2? The answer is yes, you can have more than one visa. When you enter the US, you would want to make it very clear what your intentions are. So if you're coming in to work for a TN employer, you would want to make it clear you're not entering on a B1, B2, you're entering on a TN, and that will allow you to work. Can a TD do activities like online sales? You want to be very careful. A TD does not have work authorization. So if you are engaging in active work for pay, the government may well argue that you're working without authorization. So be careful if you're doing that. So I'm going to turn to some of the question and answers that came in. When applying for jobs in the US, how should we answer the question about whether we are legally authorized to work in the US? And for the question about whether we require any type of, so should we answer no for it? So I'm not sure where these questions are coming from, if it's the I-9 or not. I believe that you may be asking about the I-9 form. If you're filling out an I-9 or the employer is, you would be legally authorized if you have it, if you have TN status. And the type of employer sponsorship, it would depend on the specific question. I'm not exactly sure where the question is coming up. So you want to make sure to read the question carefully. Sufficient ties to the home country. We talked about that before. Can someone with a master's degree apply for management consultant? Is it still risky? It really depends on how you're qualifying. So the qualification is not a master's degree. The qualification is a bachelor's degree or equivalent experience. So again, read the requirements very, very carefully. You will have to explicitly satisfy the requirement that they state. And really the risk comes from when you're not coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. You're coming to work for another company and provide services. All right, I am a Canadian and have been living and working in Texas under TN status since 2013. My position is being eliminated at the end of March due to a merger. My I-94 expires at the end of August. What is my deadline to transfer? So the TN visa, if you are terminated, you should receive a 60-day grace period to either prepare to depart or to line up an additional job. I should say the earlier of 60-day grace period or the expiration of your I-94. So if your I-94 expires before the 60-day grace period, make sure to leave before your I-94 expires. Will I be denied if I'm not vaccinated? Probably. If you are not vaccinated against COVID since, I believe, January of this year, you are very unlikely to be admitted to the US. There are very limited exceptions. Check the CDC website. One of them is that you have negative health effects to vaccinations. There is a contraindication, so that would need to be documented. Experience with the disaster relief insurance claims adjuster category. Personally, I have not personally handled an application in that category, but there is a good chance that our firm has in the past. If you're interested in discussing more, feel free to set up a consultation. I was on a TN visa, and when my role ended, I returned back to Canada, but still had the TN visa attached to my passport. What am I required to do with that TN visa after I've returned back to Canada? Really nothing. You won't be able to use the visa again to re-enter since your role has ended. But if you want another TN visa, you would essentially need to apply anew. You would need to have a new employer or job offer letter and apply as you did the first time. I have a 2-year master MBA degree from Canada and a 4-year bachelor's degree. Okay, I think this question is asking about the specific qualifications for a job. I would just have to say, go to the regulations, and if you want to discuss your specific case, feel free to reach out for a consultation. Okay, does a master degree count? You have to read the requirements. So if it says bachelor's degree, baccalaureate, or licenciatura degree, that is what it means. It is not saying that a master's would satisfy that. All right, a question about the job title. I answered that before. It does not need to exactly match. Are there any jurisdictional or state-specific elements to an application? So technically, no, there are not. So the regulations make it clear that not having a state license, if one is required, is not enough to deny a TN visa application. So to use an example, If someone is applying to work for a law firm in New York, you would typically need to be a member of the New York Bar to do that. A TN visa application is not supposed to be denied if you do not have that bar admission already. You are supposed to get it upon entry in order to work, but you're not supposed to be denied based on it. Now, the exception to that is if it is explicit in the regulations. So, for example, accountant, again, one of the bases, if you don't have a bachelor's degree, you can have a CPA or another professional license. So if you don't have a bachelor's degree and you're qualifying on the license, you would need to get the license to qualify. But if you satisfy the experience or educational requirements, you're not supposed to be denied based on any local license. The idea is that you should be able to receive that upon entry. If already in the US on a TD visa and looking to get a TN for the first time, can you apply at the border or do you have to go through USCIS? You never have to go through USCIS. Anyone applying can always go through either the consulate or, if you're Canadian, a port of entry. Does a diploma from Canada have to be 2 years of studies? It really depends on what degree you're talking about. So for certain jobs, like right now I'm looking at technical publications writer, and one of the ways to satisfy it is a post-secondary diploma or post-secondary certificate. If you look at the regulations, you will see that this is defined. A post-secondary diploma means a credential issued on completion of 2 or more years of post-secondary education by an accredited academic institution in Canada or the United States. So you want to go specifically to your job that you're going to be doing and closely look at the requirement. Okay. Few of these questions live. The bachelor's degree is the minimum requirement or the only requirement? Let's say for landscape architecture. It's going to be specific to what it says. So landscape architect, baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. So that is the requirement. You have to have one of those 2 degrees in order to get the visa. It doesn't, if you don't have that degree, but you have the master's, that is not the same thing. You have to have a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. Can someone who is on a TD visa and already in the US apply for an E2 visa while in the US? Yes, you can. You can apply for a change of status to an E2 visa while you're in the US. I see a few more questions. We unfortunately only have a minute left, but I think we only have a few more questions. Can someone who is on a TD visa apply? Yep, you can. Is there a list of TN-friendly recruitment firms? Not that I'm aware of, but you know, to be honest, the TN visa is quite straightforward. So the best way to improve your chances are to pick a job category in which you have the degree, if that's the requirement, if you're applying based on education, and really that the employer has a clear need for the role. So if you're applying to be a lawyer, it's easiest to apply through a law firm. You can certainly apply to be in-house counsel at a non-law firm, but going specifically to your question about whether there are TN-friendly firms, really, you know, just think about how to remove possible questions that the government might have. One of the questions that the government might have is, what would a lawyer do at a place that's not a law firm? You know, so anticipate those questions. But frankly, the best approach is probably to find, you know, an employer that wants to employ you, where you'll be doing work that's aligned with the job duties that are listed on OOH or ONET. Okay. So my wife's employer will be applying for her green card. Can I apply for a TN? You want to be careful. If you have a pending green card, you're absolutely right that if you're applying for a visa, it could be seen as violating the intent requirement that you plan to leave. So the recommendation is to secure your TN visa before the green card application is filed. So on a job application, technically you do not need sponsorship. So, you might want to speak with the employer about what they mean when they ask that question. Again, you need none of the things that say an H-1B visa requires, prevailing wage, all of those things I discussed before. But my recommendation would be, if you see a job where they're asking, do you need sponsorship? I would have a conversation with them. And I would say, I'm a national of Mexico or Canada, so I'm able to apply for a TN visa. My understanding is that puts minimal requirements on the employer. What do you mean when you ask whether I need sponsorship? I think it's an important discussion to have with them. And finally, for what reasons can a TN visa get rejected? The most common reason a TN visa is rejected, in my personal experience talking with people who have approached us after experiencing this, is that the job duties did not clearly align with the job that they are applying for. They are saying, I'm coming in as an economist, but they're doing things that an economist doesn't do. Or they don't actually satisfy the education requirements or the work requirements. Those are two very common issues. The final note I'll add that I didn't touch on before, and then I'll go ahead and let you all get on with your days, given the time, is that you can apply for a TN visa to work part-time. So the TN visa is fine for part-time work or full-time work. And the TN visa is also fine if you want to work for more than one TN employer. You can have concurrent TN status. So if you want to work part-time as an economist for one firm and part-time as an economist for another firm, that is allowed. You would just want to make sure that logistically it makes sense, that it's in relatively the same place and the amount of time you'd be spending at each lines up, so that it's just feasible, so that the border officer understands that makes sense. If I get a remote job with an American employer, but I'll stay in my country, do I need a visa? No, you only need a visa to physically come to the US, not to do a remote job. Can a spouse file for TN visa? They can if they qualify for it. So they'd need their own job offer. If they don't have a job, they would probably be applying for a TD visa. So thank you all very much. Those were excellent questions. I will be following up. We will be following up with an email that has a link to this video, the presentation, and our future webinars. And do check out our YouTube channel. We put a lot of free information up there that we hope is helpful to you all. And if it is helpful to have a discussion in person, please do set up a consultation. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you for taking the time today, and we hope to see you on future webinars. Thank you.